Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the fourth in the National Archives online public lecture series for 2021. I'd like to begin by apologising sincerely for the delay. The initial starting time was, of course, 6 o'clock, but due to technical issues which actually were beyond our control, we had to delay it. So some of the reminder emails with the joining details may not have got to you. Again, we are very, very sorry about that. We're very apologetic, but do know that this is being recorded and we will put the recording up on our website tomorrow. So for those of you who have been unable to attend or who are late attending, we will be making the recording available tomorrow for you, and just apologies again for that. We hope you understand. I'm sure we've all been in that position ourselves at some time or other. But we're delighted to welcome you here this evening. My name is Elizabeth McAvoy. I'm the archivist with responsibility for education and outreach. And I'd also like to welcome our two guest speakers tonight, Nicola Morris and Natalie Mill. Nicola Morris and Natalie Mill, who hopefully are on your screens there, who will present on records for house histories held in the National Archives and other Irish repositories. But before we begin, I'd just like to go through a few housekeeping details so that you can engage with our event. Audio cameras are off and mics are on mute, but we do encourage you to participate in this evening's talk using the webinars Q&A function. Natalie and Nicola's talk will run for roughly 50 minutes with 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. You will have the opportunity to submit your questions during the talk, so please type them in to the Q&A box at the bottom of the control panel because the chat box won't be operating. We will accommodate as many questions as we can, so apologies in advance if we don't get around to answering yours. We are recording this webinar, as I mentioned, and we will make it available on our YouTube channel tomorrow, as we have already done with our previous evening lectures since February when they began. We'll also be live tweeting the talk, so please like or retweet our posts at NAR Ireland. So just a little bit about this evening's talk before Nicola and Natalie begin the presentation. Over the last 300 years, the ownership, occupancy, transfer and valuation of property in Ireland has left a relatively well-documented paper trail. Surviving census returns, urban street directories and Valuation Office records can identify the listed occupiers of a house from the mid-19th century. Meanwhile, maps, plans and census returns can be explored for descriptions of houses, while earlier sources such as leases, rentals and testamentary records may document more substantial dwellings as far back as the 18th century. As to where these sources can be located, how to access them, and extract all of the relevant details relating to the history of the house and the people who lived there, all will be revealed by our two speakers this evening. Natalie Mill is an archivist who has been working in the Public Services Division of the National Archives for the past 5 years. After obtaining her first degree in the History of Art at Glasgow University, she completed her Master's in Archival Studies at the University of Liverpool. Since moving to Ireland, she has developed her interest in Irish history, with particular focus on archival sources for social and cultural history. Meanwhile, Nicola Morris has a degree in history from Trinity College Dublin, has worked as a professional genealogist since 1999, and is the director of Timeline Research Limited. She is currently Vice President of Accredited GeneaIogists Ireland and is on the board of the Irish Manuscripts Commission. Nicola lectures in family history and is a regular contributor to genealogy magazines. You may also know her from TV, where she has starred in episodes of the Who Do You Think You Are and the Great House Revival series. I'll now hand over to Natalie and Nicola to discover the history of your house with records for house histories found in the National Archives and other archival repositories in Ireland. So over to you, ladies.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Right, I'll just share this presentation and we can get started. So welcome everybody that I can't see or hear, but I hope you're out there. And myself and Natalie are going to look at sources that are available for documenting the history of your house. I think one of the challenging starting points for researching the history of your house, one of the challenges for researching the history of your house is actually locating the correct building in documentary records. So you don't want to parachute into the 1901 census and you're going to be faced with a number of houses in a townland or on a street and scratching your head going, I'm not sure which house is mine. So the trick really is to try and establish continuous occupancy of a property back to these crucial record sets. Once you know who lived there, then you should be able to identify the house in question. What's really important as well is that our houses are not necessarily identifiable in records by numbers or by specific addresses. So rural houses, for example, don't have street numbers. They are a collection of houses within a townland. The townland is really the only way to identify them. And of course, the townland may have 3, 5, 10, 15 or more houses in it. Similarly, in urban areas, the number of your house on a street today may not be the same number that was used 100 or 150 years ago. So new buildings on the street, renumbering of the street, even the change of name of the street may have happened in the intervening time. Similarly, the different record sets that we're going to be looking at do not have a continuous or a common numbering system. So the number of a house in the census return is not going to be the same as the number used in a particular set of land records, and is not necessarily going to be the same as the number that's used in a street directory. So you want a source that's going to give you a record of continuous occupancy working backward, preferably from the present day, or at least from the earliest point that you know of the person who lived in the house. So there's two sources that are going to help you determine this. One of them is street directories, and then the Valuation Office revision books. So to just start with street directories, I'm going to be Dublin centric here and talk about Tom's Dublin directory, but of course most of the cities and market towns around the country, there are some kinds of directories, perhaps even electoral rolls that you could consult that are going to give you a record of occupancy over the course of the last 100 years. Tom's Dublin directory dates from about the 1840s right up to the last edition, which was published in 2012. So it's very contemporary. It's available in the Dublin City Library and Archive on the open shelves when they are open, and also online at Ancestry. They have copies from the 1840s up to 1947, and it's possible to browse them. I'd always recommend browsing them rather than using the search engines, because that way you know you've landed on the right street and actually taken a look for yourself at the relevant records. Again, directories for Belfast, Cork, Limerick, Galway, other Irish towns and cities can be found in the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, local county and city archives, the National Library of Ireland, and many of them being digitised and published online. So street directories allow you, particularly Tom's Dublin directory, you're able to look up the streets in Dublin City and Dublin suburbs, and then find out who was living on the street, again, by house number, and these are the actual numbers that should apply to contemporary housing. I would often use this to jump back every 5 years or even 10 years and to find out if the name of the occupier of your particular house has changed, and keep working backwards to help you document who was living in the house. Now, not all occupiers appear in street directories, and as you work back into the 19th century, you are not necessarily going to pick up everybody. So you may find that a particular street is simply described as 8 cottages, and you're not going to get the name of the occupiers of those cottages. Similarly, some streets you will find buildings that are just described as tenements. So bearing in mind that sometimes this isn't going to work, if you are looking at a house in Dublin or another large Irish city, the street directories may help you to document who was living in the house back as far as least as the 1901 and 1911 census, or potentially even back into the 1850s or even earlier. So this is just an example from Tom's directory. I looked up my own house. where I live at the moment, Tritonville Road, and you can see 1947, Mrs. Seawright, 1925, Mrs. Seawright is still there, and then in 1885 we have a Mr. Josiah Calvert, and it looks like he may have given the house a name. Is it Danville? Danvilla. What Tom's is really great for as well is actually just giving you that little bit of a description of the street. So we see that Tritonville Road in Sandymount is from London Bridge Road to Serpentine Avenue, which means that the numbering system will start at the London Bridge Road end and runs all the way up to the Serpentine Avenue end. And you also get a reference to the intersecting streets. So I know I'm looking at the right house because my house is on the corner of Claremont Road. The other source for documenting a sort of a continuous occupancy of property are the Valuation Office revision books. These are manuscript copies of Griffith's Valuation, and Natalie is going to talk about Griffith's Valuation in a little bit. These records were maintained in order to reassess the valuation of property for the purposes of tax, and these what became the rates that were charged on property. So they are a continuous record of that property from the 1850s right up to the 1970s, when the charging of rates on residential properties ceased in Ireland. The changes that were made by the valuators whenever they revised their records were updated in coloured ink. This is really helpful because they wrote the date of the update in the margin in the same coloured ink. And you'll see from the example I'm going to show you in a second how this becomes really, really important when you're reviewing these records. The Valuation Office revision books are held in the Valuation Office in the Irish Life Centre on Abbey Street in Dublin. They are not available online. So you will need to visit or have somebody make copies or apply to the Valuation Office for copies of books that you are interested in for your own property. Because the records run, you can either search them from the 1850s working forward, but for our purposes, we're looking at starting in the 1970s, identifying your own house, and then working backwards to identify the owners and occupiers. And any changes to the ownership, occupancy, size, and value of the property, which means that in the 1950s, you might find a note that says motorhome was added to the building. So a garage was added to the building. The valuation might change if it goes down, possibly because the buildings have fallen into disrepair, or if it goes up, perhaps improvements and so on had been made to the buildings. So this is just an example of the revision books. This is for the townland of Reenagowna in Leitrim, and what we can see here on the first lot, we've Thomas Brady, who leased a land-only lot from the Earl of Granard. And if we go over to the margin here, we can see in 1907, written in green, this refers to this entry here, in fee. That means that Thomas Brady purchased his holding under the Land Annuity Purchase Act in 1907, or at least the valuator was informed that this change had taken place and made the record in 1907. The event or the transaction itself may have happened in the previous maybe 5 years or so. Also written in green there, we have house, H-O, added to the land, which means the house was built on this property at once Thomas had purchased it. So again, if you're looking to date the construction of a house, in this instance, it looks like it's in and around the period of 1907 when the house was purchased. Crossed out in red is Thomas Brady, and written above him is Andy Canning. And over in the margin here, we see in red 1911. So the property transferred from Thomas Brady to Andy Canning in 1911. And then in 1913, in a sort of a lovely aubergine, Andy was crossed out and Ambrose is written above. So Ambrose Canning becomes the occupier in 1913, according to those records. So you can see just from this one entry, we've got quite a lot of detail already about that property, when it was built, and at least 3 persons who were recorded as occupiers of this building. Now, the Valuation Office, along with the revision books, also have Valuation Office maps. This is an example of the Union map. Well, what I've always been described as the Union map. You might also refer to them as revision maps as well. This map dates from the 1880s. So anybody that has looked at Griffith's Valuation online at Ask About Ireland will have come across these maps where they are incorrectly labelled as Griffith's maps. The coloured maps on Ask About Ireland are the Union maps. They date from the 1880s and they're from the Valuation Office. They give you the boundaries of every single landholding or lot and their number. The thicker red lines are then the boundaries of the townlands themselves. Why these are really valuable for your research is that if you want to dive into this particular collection of maps and locate your household, your house or the plot of land that you're researching, this will give you its lot number in relation to the Valuation Office records. It's the lot number that was assigned to that property in the 1880s and not at the time of Griffith's valuation or not in the 1920s. It's important to remember that the Valuation Office, as it revised its records, did change lot numbers. So the lot numbers on here, which we've read Townland of Reenagowna and Lot 1, this refers only to Lot 1 in the 1880s, but it will at least lead you to the correct land holding in the revision books, and you can then start working forwards and backwards to identify the other occupiers and owners and changes to that particular property. So over to you, Natalie.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the 1901 and 1911 census. You've probably used it for genealogical purposes, as you've probably used a lot of our sources that you'll see this evening from regarding house histories. Now, the 1901 and 1911 census, as you know, is the first surviving and available complete census for the 32 counties. You know, as I say, it will be used for genealogical purposes in the main, but there is the B forms that we'll be talking about that's useful for house history. The units of division are important to note, and as with the other sources I'm going to talk about, it is important to know what you're talking about. Barony, parish, DED, district electoral division, and as you can see, that's how the census was divided. And now, as Nicola said earlier, numbering of houses, and certainly your current numbers of houses, are fairly a modern phenomenon. What the numbers you'll get in the census may not, we're highly unlikely to relate to your modern day numbering system, and that's because the enumerator did it themselves. Generally, in towns, in urban areas, there may have been numbering, but certainly in rural areas, for the sake of the census data collation, the enumerator allocated the number themselves. Now, this now causes issues because people are thinking that they're looking for number one wherever, and it doesn't relate to what they know their house as. Unfortunately, although the enumerators did work with mapping and did map the numbers that they applied to each house in a townland, those M forms, those M documents no longer exist. So this is where research comes into it. So as you're probably, if you've done genealogy and now you've gone on to your house history, which is often common, the last point there are the usual sort of the information that you'll find about on the A forms, which is the main census returns about individuals and households. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, but it's actually the B forms which are most useful to your house history. So as you'll see, they're filled in by the census enumerator themselves rather than the householder. They summarise the returns for that townland or street, recording information about the property and the number of families living in each abode. And it also evaluated the quality of the house by categorising it into 4 levels according to Census Office guidelines. So that's a very interesting point, that they're actually it's not necessarily about people, but it is about the property, and that's probably what is most interesting for your house history. So the forms include questions about houses such as the materials it was used for construction, its functions such as if it was a private dwelling, a public building, a school, a hotel or a pub, its function, its number of stories, the number of rooms and the number of windows. Also, the number of outbuildings and the details of that are recorded on the B2 forms. So anyway, let's have a look at them in the next slide. So this is the B1 form. You probably you wouldn't be able to see it so closely there, but rest assured on our National Archives Census website, you can see the B forms and they're high res and you can zoom in. And it's important to actually note what is said in those 19 columns of information about the buildings. So the 19 columns detailed the property. You know, they note particulars. You'll see that there's a lot of text and there are particulars about the construction of the walls. You'll see the numbers below, and if they were made of stone, brick or concrete, they were given a number 1, or if they were made of more perishable materials such as mud or wood, they were given 0. So that's interesting to note as you go along, that this is the enumerator filling this out and figuring out and assessing the building itself according to the guidelines. So there's also materials of the roof are noted, the number of windows and the number of rooms. And if you were able to zoom in, it's very important to sort of read this form correctly, because you could think that a number saying 1 means you've got 1 room. If you've got 6 rooms, that they note 6, but that's not actually the case. So just be aware that, you know, if you've got a number 2 as in under how many rooms, that actually means it's got 2 to 4 rooms. If it's a number 3, it actually means there are 5 to 6 rooms. If there's a number 6, that means it's got 13 or more rooms. So don't assume that it's got 6 rooms because of that number. You must understand how, you know, what the enumerator's guidelines were, and it is noted on the form. And as I say, you will be able to zoom in and understand that better when you actually look at it on our website. What they did with all those numbers along there, assessing the quality of the as I say, the construction, the number of rooms, the number of windows, the roof materials, the enumerator then totted up the total and then designated a class for the house. So there was first, second, third and fourth class of houses, and the least numbers that, you know, were accumulated meant that you were in the lower class of house. So that's you know, as it said, you know, a first class house means first class. Fourth class, you know, would be sort of the lower echelons of the housing. Now, there also, you'd see noted the number of families in each house, the head of household, the number of rooms occupied by those people in that property, and the number of each family, and also the landholder. So if they don't own the house, or, well, you know, you would also note who owned the house. So let's go on to the next slide, and you'll just see an example of Form B2, which doesn't look as, you know, isn't half as interesting or descriptive. It's more like a tick form. So as you see, you'll see the columns, and it's all about outhouses. So obviously not all properties had B2 forms, and they might have multiples. But, you know, some of the columns are noting whether it has a stables, a coach house, a harness room, a forge, a barn, a shed, and a laundry. So all sorts of different types of outhouses are recorded on there. Nothing to do with, no sort of conservatories or anything like that noted, but, you know, real proper substantial buildings are noted there. So next slide, please. And this, I don't mean to patronise you, but just so that you know where to find them, because often we get emails in saying people are looking for this B form. You'll see a Form N there as well, and that's just almost a summary of the B form is the nitty-gritty about the buildings. But I just wanted to show you where they're found, because often we get people emailing in and they don't know where they are, but they are there. and you can have many pages of them. And you know, the A form, as I say, is the obvious genealogical source, but the B forms are available online there, and you can find them just by exploring properly. So next slide, please. And then we'll go on to the Griffiths valuation. It's commonly known as the Griffiths valuation, also known as the primary valuation. So do bear those in mind when the interchangeable terms can confuse people. So it's the first full-scale published valuation of land and property in Ireland, undertaken by the Valuation Office under Richard Griffith, hence its name. It's important to note that it's not a census of people. So this, again, is used as a genealogical source, and it has its limits as a genealogy source, but it comes into its own when you're talking about property and land. So this, you know, this is what its purpose was for, although it was obviously undertaken always to get some money out of you, so for tax reasons. It is a superb substitute and provides a good picture of mid-19th century lives. So it's essentially a list of ratepayers. It was undertaken to determine the amount of tax payable to the Poor Law Union. It's arranged by civil parish, so that's very much something important to bear in mind, you know, how things are arranged and by which parcel of land they're arranged by. Now, it records about 70% of households, or a little bit more, provides 1.25 million names of landholders, and covers about 20 million acres. So that sounds impressive, but do bear in mind about the people that will miss. So again, that's around 30%. A lot of people were excluded from it. So again, you're looking for property, and this is what you'll get for a certain amount. So there are no family details, but the property, I'll show you a moment, an example. So the production, what is the Griffiths valuation, is a printed valuation book. So it's showing the names of occupiers of land and buildings and those from whom it was leased and the amount and value of the property held. It's a printed publication. So it's Nicola's already referred to it. It's on askaboutireland.ie, Griffiths valuation. It's a very good site. It has maps, even though they don't, you know, as Nicola was saying, they don't precisely correspond to the publication itself, but it is a very good site, freely available, and you know, so have a look at it. Next slide, please. So this is what you will see. This is Griffiths valuation. This is the product of it. I'll go on to talk about sort of the affiliated documents that produce this in a couple of minutes. But it shows the names of the occupiers of the land, the buildings you'll see there. It's got a good example where there are women mentioned. They're often widows, but it's nice to see some ladies there. The names of those for whom it was leased, and the amount and value of the property held. So thank you. It's pretty obvious, and it's nice to read because it's printed. So we're grateful for that. So we'll go on to the Evaluation Office books. So these are the preliminary records compiled in connection with the primary valuation, the Griffiths valuation. So all of these books went to produce that printed volume. So as you'll see, what was produced, the documentation produced for that valuation were house books, field books, mill books, quarto books, and tenure books. They're arranged by county, barony, civil parish and townland. Again, do take a note of what parcels of land are used. House books are the most important for the topic we're talking about today. And, you know, Nicola was mentioning the revision books and or cancellation books that are held by the Valuation Office, but we have manuscript, the original records dating from around 1830 to 1865. So you know, anything later than that, you want to go to the Valuation Office themselves, and we've got that raft of 19th century records. So what you will see is that there is a lot of material available to search online free on our website. What is available are the house books, but from microfilm copies, digitized from microfilm. But we should note that what is available online are the accessions, the books that we received during the 1940s. So any subsequent accessions, so we had a major accession in 2013, they're not available online. You'd have to come in and see them. So do take a note of that URL, but you'll be able to find that easily on our website. And you know, so do bear that in mind. So the field books were valuation of land in rural areas, gave a description and of the quality of the soil, quality of the ground, the area, and the rate per acre. The rent records of rents paid. The quarto books were additional information on urban areas, and then the tenure books were obviously about tenure, and we got a lot of those in 2013, and so not many of them are available online. So next slide, please. So the house books are most important to you as doing your house history, also known archivally in the National Archives reading room as the OL4s. So they were carried out under the Acts 1826 to 1836. So what's complicated, and Valuation Office material could have, well, and has done, could have a whole series of lectures about them that go on for hours, because it's a complicated collection of records. And knowing the dates and the acts and when this legislation came in and when things changed, it does make a difference for you actually noting when you're getting at the details, the timings for your house. So it is important to note these things. The house books date from about 1830 onwards, and initially they were the houses for the townland valuation, houses valued over £5. Now, £5 was pricey at the time, so there weren't that many houses noted. So that was quite evident in the returns. So, but this changed in 1844 when all holdings under £5 were valued. So that's when. That's sort of when you'll find, the smaller, significant but smaller buildings, and not sort of the big houses that were, expensive. So the house books recorded details of living conditions, the area, the construction of materials, and quality and rate per measure. It recorded the occupier's name and a description of the property. It often had sketches and observations noted by the valuer. So next slide, please. And this is a lovely example, and it's not uncommon to have those lovely observations in that column there by the valuer. You'll see that this is about Colonel Massey. I don't know if you can see it so well on the screen, but Colonel Massey and John Moore of Longford Terrace in Dunleary. In the columns there, the manuscript handwritten columns, they're talking about the house and the basement and the privy and the stable and the coal vault and the passage. So totting up all of the value of that house. And then the lovely illustration that the valuer has done on that side of notes and observations actually is incredible to show you the layout of the house. You can see the back of the passage behind there in the gardens, and as I say, that this isn't unusual to have that lovely illustration, but this is a good example. So do check them out. You might get lucky with an illustration like that really gives you an understanding. Again, you'll see the numbering there. Again, that's applied by the valuer. So always take them with a pinch of salt. I was zooming in on that earlier and trying to transcribe the notes underneath, but it was something about finishing the paving and doing the painting and having a loan of 30 years. So it would imply that those houses were new at the time. So, you know, do check try and read the documents properly. So next slide, please. Lovely. I didn't realise I finished that already.
So another source then, again, these sort of all are starting to fall in and around the mid-19th century, but are the Landed Estate Court or the LEC rentals. So the Landed Estate Court or Encumbered Estate Court was established in 1849. We all remember NAMA. So this was essentially NAMA for the mid-19th century. It was established to assist almost bankrupt owners of land in Ireland dispose of their estates. So the poor wealthy owners were in trouble and needed some state's assistance to get out of it. So the part of the process of breaking up these estates and or arranging for their sale, a brochure was created. And it's these brochures that are really valuable for house history research because they can contain so much detail about the property. So the brochure, you're going to find an advertisement at the front page, which will inform you of who the party was that was bringing the property for sale, what the property was. Often you don't generally find one whole large landed estate being sold. They were broken up into small little packages. So you'll generally find one or two townlands, or in an urban area, perhaps only part of a street or a number of streets. So they're quite small items going up for sale. You'll get the particulars of the tenure as they relate to the person who is selling the property. This may have been the actual owner of the property, but similarly could have been a developer who had undertaken a lease for the land, built the properties, built the houses, built a number of houses on it, which he then sublet out to tenants. So you'll get all of those details of tenure described in this brochure, because obviously the persons purchasing it need to know the conditions of the sale. So again, any leases that are attached to the property may have stipulations in them in terms of access to water, hunting rights, turbary rights, other details like that, so that those conditions will be passed on to the new purchaser. A description of the property. Now, if the house you're looking at is specifically being sold as part of the LEC, then you can get a really beautiful, detailed description of the building. So if we're talking about a big house here and it goes up for sale under the Landed Estate Court, then you will get detailed descriptions of sort of the rooms, the condition, the quality, the gardens, you know, how it was laid out. So that can be really, really valuable because it paints a picture of the building in the mid-19th or in the second half of the 19th century. If the property being sold, say, is a townland with a number of tenants, you will have a record of the tenants and details of their tenure, because obviously the purchaser is going to be taking on sitting tenants, including whether they had any leases, whether they were tenants at will. The brochure can also then have a map of the townland with the boundaries of each tenant's properties, and again, numbered according to the numbering system in this brochure. And then if you're very lucky and you are looking at an estate house being sold, I've seen etchings and drawings of the estate house itself being included in the brochure. So there can be quite a lot of detail in these records. They're held in the National Archives of Ireland, but they have been digitised and published online at Find My Past as well. Just to show you an example, these are just two extracts from a Landed Estate Court rental. The particulars of tenure there in the top part, that would have been in the early part of the brochure. And I think that's particularly, it's really interesting and it gets quite complicated because the particulars of tenure tell us here that in 1845, William O'Hara demised or leased to Thomas Kirby plot of ground on the east side of the road leading from Tritonville to Serpentine Avenue, part of Bagot Rath. But this was originally part of the lands demised by the Honourable Sidney Herbert to William O'Hara by an indenture dated April 1843 for a term of 96 years. And there was a covenant by the lessor, who would be Herbert, that the front walls of the dwelling house or houses to be built on said premises should be fully 30 feet back from the footway of said new road bounding said premises on the west, and the other usual covenants in the leases. So that tiny paragraph there gives us a huge amount of information about the property. Originally leased, the ground was leased by Herbert to O'Hara. There was a stipulation about walls that were going to be built and that houses were intended to be built on this property. O'Hara in turn leases the property in 45 to Thomas Kirby, a plot of ground. And if we look down then here on this is a record of the tenants, there is then a reference to a lease between Kirby and George Irwin, made in 1867 for a plot of ground, and that stipulates that Irwin is to build a house, and they've rather confusingly said, no house of a lesser value than £400 on the premises demised, which basically means he has to build a house worth more than £400 on this site. So we've got a really instant picture there of the development of this part of the street, clearly happening between about 1845 and 1867, that the landowner could stipulate conditions as to how the house is to be built. And that's really important when you look at sort of the Georgian streets and squares of Dublin and other Irish cities. They were not necessarily all built by one person. The owner of the land broke their holding up into lots, would have leased the lots in smaller amounts to a number perhaps of builders or developers, and then stipulated in the lease exactly how they wanted the house to be built. So that it had to meet that criteria, be a certain number of stories, be a certain distance from the road, have a basement, and so on. And that's how we get the uniformity, even though they may not have all been built by the same person at the same time. So again, that's the sort of insight that you can extract from the Landed Estate Court rentals. There is also an example of the maps that come with it. This is just a townland. They can be really beautiful maps, actually. I think most mapping from the mid to 19th century working backwards are actually just gorgeous to look at. You've got the townland divided up into lots, and again that's going to give you the lot number that corresponds with the list of tenants. So again, you can double check that you are looking at the right house by making sure that the property you know on the map matches up with the lot number that you've been researching. And for more mapping, Natalie.
So this is the Ordnance Survey 6-inch maps, 6 inches to the mile. This is the last source I'll talk about that sort of all underpin the Griffith Valuation. And these are the nitty-gritty maps. And there's map people out there who will love this. This is a lovely source. They're interlinked with the valuation, and the Ordnance Survey was actually established solely to enable the valuation of land for the purposes of taxation. So in the National Archives reading room, we'll know them as OS 105s, but they're also called fair plans as well. So again, maybe a different sort of terminology you might not be used to, but we're all talking about the same thing. So the basic unit used by the OS in the first 6-inch survey was the parish. Each parish was given a unique reference number, and then the country was divided into 5 districts, A, B, C, D, and E, and they did not follow county boundaries. Within these districts, a parish was given a distinct number. So if I go on to the next slide.
Sorry.
This is what you'll see in the reading room finding aids in the National Archives. It's rudimentary, but it's very straightforward. It's quite clear. Doesn't follow county lines. Don't even really know what lines it follows, but it does. It's a system that works. So you'd be looking for the next, so that's the map detailing the districts, and then the finding aid for the fair plans, or the the 6-inch maps will show you that if you were looking for Kilmore and Wexford, you'd be wanting to order an OS 105, and then the A and the 360 is what you will have got in from the parish number, the district, and then the parish number. And Kilmore parish was split over 2 sheets, which is why it's got 2 numbers there. And with all of this valuation and the valuations that took, started at the top of the country and went all the way around, you must sort of it took many years. So you could something could be mapped in 1840, another one in 1852, for example. So when you're trying to be specific, do try and note under what kind of circumstance it was mapped. So so that's pretty obvious. So if you go to the next slide, please. So so these are the manuscripts drawing. What I'm talking about is the maps are the manuscripts that were then engraved and printed for the Griffith Valuation. They were drawn, each parish was drawn separately on large double elephant size paper, and as you'll see, like Kilmore parish, some share a sheet, some are large parishes and are spread over several sheets. The 6-inch to the mile is what the printed engraved maps were. So there's not too much difference, but the original maps can contain details omitted in the engravings. And I've seen an example where keys to the buildings in the town haven't transferred to the engravings. Yes, and I'll show you an example of a map, a lovely map. But they're coloured as well. So the colour varies according to sheet, but all buildings are coloured, which helps with the readability. And in the next slide, you'll actually see an example. And you won't be able to see it too well here, but maybe some of you might identify it as Cork, the city of Cork there, and the River Lee going through the city, and the parishes of St Finbar, St Nicholas, St Mary's and St Anne's are all on that map. And as you can see with the colouring of the buildings, you can see on instant, just without zooming in, how populated it was in 1840. So I think thank you.
And then part of the process of the Ordnance Survey was the creation of the Ordnance Survey name books. And as you go work back researching the history of a property, you are going to get to the point where you're starting to run out of documentary evidence relating specifically to the building that you're researching, but actually gathering sort of local history in relation to the history of the townland and the parish can sometimes extract other little nuggets of information that will start adding to your story about the origins of the house. And one of these is the Ordnance Survey name books. They're prepared by John O'Donovan and his team of Irish language experts. And although I haven't seen the play, this is, I think, that the theme of Brian Friel's play Translations. They travelled the entire countryside, visiting every single parish and townland, as well as carrying out detailed academic research of documentary sources to ascertain the original Irish name for the townland, and then determine how that name was used throughout history and using documentary sources as well as interviews with local people, and to then create a sort of a standardized, anglicized version of that townland name, but maintaining, I suppose, what it originally had been and where it had come from, and at least a record of that. So it's quite a valuable record. I'll just go show you an example from the name books. This is a rather blurry copy from townland in the civil parish of Duin, County Kerry. So we've Laca na Rinon was the old name, Laca meaning hillside, and then we have all the different variants of Laca that show up in the sources that O'Donovan himself consulted from interviewing the parish priest, the county cess collector, the tithe, the allotment books, and so on. One of the other details that you get are the boundaries of the townland, so what other townlands are around it, and then details on the actual property itself. So you have the name of the landlord, the proprietor, William Locke, who's now living in Paris, agent Adam Murray, who's living in Parliament Street in London. They're all tenants, there are no leases, so they're tenants at will, they can be evicted at a moment's notice. There is a rental income on the property, on the entire townland, about £175, and then a description of the soil. So the soil is not good quality, part bog, heathy, a spongy pasture. So again, these tiny little details will help to start building up the picture of the story. In addition to the Ordnance Survey name books, which are in the National Library of Ireland and are slowly appearing on the Ask About Ireland website, there are the Ordnance Survey Memoirs. So when the Ordnance Survey began, it started in the north and worked its way south. So the very early mapping, as well as research, was undertaken in the counties in Ulster. And these memoirs were a great idea, but were so time consuming that they finished them up after Ulster and didn't carry on, because they gathered vast amounts of information on the topography, the local economy, the geology, the industry, the agriculture, the religion, the education, the emigration for every single civil parish, which makes these memoirs incredibly valuable if you're interested in the population of a particular townland or parish in the 1830s. But of course, we're missing them for all the rest of the country, which is disappointing. But they just took far too long and were far too resource heavy to create. And then you also have the Ordnance Survey letter books, and this is the correspondence between John O'Donovan and his team as they travelled to the countryside, again, writing about and commenting on what they were encountering. So forts, ancient ruins, other sort of holy wells, other items of note in the landscape that they are researching the history of, as well as persons that they met and where they stayed. So all of which can be used to extract detail on properties, or perhaps the persons who might have been living in the properties, or the context of the lives around the property. And so a lot of other published sources, just to give you a quick quick list. Again, I can't cover everything that there is. These are only some of the highlights. Samuel Lewis's Topographical Dictionary of Ireland. There is a list at the end of this, and we're going to leave up for you to screenshot, that'll have all of these details recorded. So Samuel Lewis's Topographical Dictionary of Ireland, published in 1837, a detailed description of every civil parish in the country, as well as most of the market towns and cities. What's useful about Lewis's is that he lists the gentlemen's seats. So again, if you're researching a big house, sort of the house of the gentleman or the landed gentry, you should find them listed in Lewis's, which will just tell you at least who was the recorded occupier of the house at that particular time. And also the houses tended to have names. So you can track that. And then similarly, Ambrose Leith's Directory to the Market Towns, Villages and Gentlemen's Seats and Other Noted Places in Ireland, but this time published in 1814. So again, looking at the list of gentlemen's seats in 1814, it's going to give you a record of who were living in the big houses. And you may spot a change of occupancy of the house that you're interested in. Ireland has always been a tourist destination. So there are still diaries and letters and accounts of tours and travels in Ireland from the 18th and early 19th century, which are very illuminating, particularly because the traveller would have stayed sometimes in the big houses, sometimes in hostelries, perhaps visiting local cottages of the poorer persons in the parish. And so their personal accounts of their experiences and descriptions of the houses that they've seen and stayed in can, if they mention the house that you're interested in, be very valuable. Your research of a house, if it's a house that's part of a landed family, that belongs to a landed family, or indeed a house that's on an estate belonging to a landed family, you want to start researching estate records. So the Landed Estate Database is a good place to start. There are other resources for researching estate records in the National Library and the National Archives as well, but we would need another hour and a half to go into that. I'm not going to keep you here much longer. So the Landed Estate Database is a good place to start because there are a lot of resources there, and identifying the owners and occupiers of the big houses and the estate houses around the country. It's not comprehensive, but it's a good starting place. And of course, the Irish Architectural Archive, I think I'd be shot if I didn't mention them, who also host the Dictionary of Irish Architects. The Irish Architectural Archive is on Merrion Square. It is open to the public, not currently, but hopefully it will be. And you can visit, and they have an incredible library, but they also have this beautiful photographic collection, which is organized by location. So you can go to the county, the parish, the townland, or the city and the street to see, do they have any historic photographs that are relevant to the property that you're researching? And again, the Dictionary of Irish Architects becomes important if you're able to identify persons who are associated with the building of the property, and not necessarily, you know, just architects. I mean, you find a lot of builders who would come in under that category of architects. And then a favorite of mine, there is plenty of mapping. I mean, we've looked at the Ordnance Survey maps, but then there are also individuals who would have commissioned mapping projects and cartographers who have been mapping Ireland over the last hundreds of years, and their work is incredibly valuable and beautiful. And one of these are the Taylor and Skinner's Road Maps of Ireland, published in 1777 and then revised in 1782, online at swilson.info. So these can be quite a challenge to look at. They are the road maps of Ireland, so a sort of a gazetteer or a guide, but it's a book, and the roads are broken up to fit onto each page. And then they're also all oriented generally from north to south or south to north. So some of these roads may be running from east to west across the country, but when you're looking at them here, they're going to be running up and down the page. So it can take a little bit of time to orient yourself on this road to figure out exactly where you are. But what's wonderful about these is as you may be able to see, are the little drawings of the houses. And so again, these are going to be the big houses. You will also get hostelries. You have a reference to a church here, bridges, rivers, and so on. But the little houses, and we get the names of the occupiers, again, back in the second half of the 18th century. Now, it's said that these were only included, they only included the subscribers to the publication, so that your vanity would, by paying to subscribing to the publication, then you would get included on the map. So your house would appear on the map. I don't know how true this is, so I'm not going to say that this is a comprehensive record of all of the big houses. But if you find what you're looking for, again, it confirms who was there and the fact that the house was there at that particular time, because you're coming back to the period when you're trying to date the building of a house. And to finish, we have a few minutes to go, and I'm going to tackle one of the most vast and complex sources for researching the history of our house in 5 minutes. So the Registry of Deeds is this incredible repository of records that document the transactions relating to property on the island of Ireland. It was established in 1708, so it's one of the earliest sources documenting property. And when I say transactions, really anything that involved the transfer of property. So leases, sales, mortgages, trusts, marriage settlements, bequests following a will or a death, business partnerships. There are so many reasons why property may have had to change hands or be placed into a trust. And those records, which we refer to as deeds, would have been lodged in the Registry of Deeds. One of the problems is that it was not compulsory to lodge those records in the Registry of Deeds. So what's there is not a complete and comprehensive record of all transactions. It's simply those that were actually lodged with them. And that said, it is still an enormous, vast collection. So leases, as we saw with the landed estate court rentals, can refer to the presence of a building or instructions for the construction of a building on a land holding. And if you're tracing, say, a big house or a property, a farm, building, a mill, anything like that, back into the 18th or through the 19th century, you may find leases for the land on which the property is built up to a certain point, and then you might find a lease that finally refers to a dwelling house. And that's going to help you to narrow down the point at which the property was most likely built, and also potentially who was responsible for the building of the property. For builders and developers, I mean, the same essentially as it is today, if you could lease yourself a plot of land and build several buildings on it. You could lease out a number of those buildings, perhaps occupy one of them yourself, but you suddenly had an income. And that was an income that was going to see you through a retirement, pay for your children to be educated, and perhaps just allow your family to take that one step up in the social economic ladder. So the Registry of Deeds contains all of these details. Leases, again, give you an awful lot of insight into when a building might have been constructed, and then, of course, the hands it passed through in its history. So who purchased it, who leased it, who rented it, who got a mortgage on it. Was it part of a marriage settlement, a dowry, or did it pass to somebody as a bequest or part of a business partnership? You will often find leases that were more recent. So let's say you find a lease for your house in the 1860s or even in the early 20th century, may refer to earlier transactions of that property. So may refer to a lease, that original lease that was made in 1792. So you can kind of bunny hop your way back to earlier records. So start late and work backwards. Accessing the records is challenging. You don't need a degree in law, but you certainly need to be prepared to wade through the legalese, the language in these documents as you find them. So the records in the Registry of Deeds are organised two different indexes. There's a place name index and a surname index. The place name index is going to be most useful for researching property. It's an index of townlands organised by county, and then from 1833 by barony within the county. When I say alphabetically by townland name, I just mean alphabetically by the first letter of the townland name. So in the index books, say the index books for 1708 to 1738, all the B's in County Monaghan are going to be in one set of the book. Now, when you think about how many Bally this and Bally that townlands there are, there's a lot of legwork to get through that. Be patient, be persistent, and if you can do it online, the link below here to the familysearch.org, digital images of these indexes is there. You can at least sit there in your pajamas with a cup of tea doing it, rather than having to pore over these books in the Registry of Deeds itself. The surname index is the name of the grantor who granted the property, essentially. Sometimes the name of the grantee will appear in the surname index, but that's not guaranteed. So really you need to know who it was that was making the lease for the property if you want to use the grantor index. The indexes will refer you to a book number, a page number, and the memorial number in the memorial book. The memorial book is simply a copy of the original deed that was made when it was lodged in the registry. Now, these records have all been digitized up to 1929 and published by Family Search. They haven't been indexed. These are just images of the books, so you need to do the legwork yourself. And then there's also a very partial index on the irishdeedsindex.net that is ongoing. It's growing all the time. People are contributing to it, but it's certainly not reflective of the entire collection. So this is just an example of the place name index for Dublin City, 1708 to 1738. And you have now, not that common, but on the left-hand margin, we have a description of the house and holdings. So we have Mr. James Carroll's 2 houses. But actually, here is how the records are organised. So under G, we have Golden Lane, George's Lane, another for George's Lane. And so we have Golden Lane, specifically Mr. Carroll's 2 houses. And then we have a list of transactions here. Yes, you are going to need to get your magnifying glass out and the paracetamol. So these are all the transactions relating to Golden Lane, not in this period, because you're going to have to keep going through this index for 1708 to 38, because there may be additional references to Golden Lane. So this isn't everything, but it is a number of transactions. So you have the 2 parties to the transaction, the number of the book, the number of the page, and the number of the memorial. As I said, be really careful when you're transcribing these. 4s can look like 7s, 8s can look like 0s. And if you go away to look up the book in the memorial, to look up the memorial book and put this image away, and then discover in the memorial book that that reference isn't correct, and you want to go back and check it, it's another half an hour's work. So, you know, screen print or take some kind of digital image of this so you can refer back to it and make sure you've got the best transcript you can. It refers to 2 parties to the deed. There can often be 3, 4, 6, 7 or more parties to a deed. So just because the two names you're looking for may not show up here, that doesn't mean that there aren't other parties named in the actual deed itself. So do your work on the indexes, get your list of potential deeds, and then you want to look at the memorial books, which are going to reveal to you, this is sort of an extract from a deed to the registrar, a memorial of an indentured deed of assignment bearing the date 30th of day of May in the year of our Lord 1846, and it gives us the various parties here. I think there's 4 or 5 parties to this, the addresses of these parties, and then the terms of the transaction. So it's within the terms of the transaction that you're looking for a reference to your house. Bear in mind that, say, some marriage settlements or some transactions can involve a large number of townlands all being put into a trust or being transferred to another party, in which case the reference to one tenanted house in that collection is probably not going to show up in this deed. But you may find a deed that is specific to a building or a part of a townland, and that tenant or occupier is cited in the deed. Details of the house, perhaps the gardens, the walls, the boundary properties, so Mr. Farrell's house on the west and bounded by Mr. Moore's house on the east. And again, that helps you to position the property and potentially take the ownership or occupancy of a landholding back to the early 18th century. So this is the, as promised, list of most, I think, of the sources that we've referred to and links on where you can find them. So feel free to take a screenshot, and thank you very much for your time and your patience this evening. Any questions?
Nicola and Natalie, thank you both. That was a terrific presentation. Nicola, if I could ask you to stop screen sharing there, please, for a sec, and I will bat a few questions to the Q&A box. Has been busy. So an email or a question from Gerard O'Rourke wanting to clarify the valuation maps and specifically numbered plots do not correspond with Griffith's numbered lots. Is that the case?
So if you go to Ask About Ireland, the coloured map is the Valuation Office Union map, and it dates from the 1880s. It may or may not correspond with the Griffiths numbers, because we don't know whether the Griffith lot number has changed between the 1850s when Griffiths was published and the 1880s when that map was drawn up. However, on the same site, you can actually cycle back through the different layers of maps, and you'll find the black and white copies, which are the actual Griffiths maps. I know it's terribly complicated, and they can have the lot numbers that correspond with Griffiths, but don't always have the lot numbers. So just the coloured map really corresponds with what the lot number was in the 1880s. And I can't guarantee that that's the same as what's in Griffith's valuation. It may have changed in the interim.
Okay, thank you for that, Nicola. A query came in from Brian Gurran. It's quite lengthy, so I would suggest, Mr. Gurran, if you wanted either to direct it to our query, a nationalarchives.ie address, or perhaps, Nicola, you might like to answer it if he emails you at a timeline research.
I think I know Brian in any case.
Fair enough.
So, yes.
I have a question here from Angela, who, excellent presentation. Well, that's very true. 2 questions. Any idea when the LEC records for the rest of the country might be published? And secondly, where can the OS memoirs be accessed?
Sorry, what was the first part of that?
The first one, any idea when the LEC records for the rest of she has county, but maybe country might be published?
I think everything that's in the LEC is published, in that it's not a comprehensive source for all sales of property. But what there is in the National Archives, as far as I know, has been published on Find My Past.
And this was a 2-parter. Where can the OS memoirs be accessed?
Oh, they are published. So they are, you can get copies of them in most libraries. I think the originals are in the Royal Irish Academy, maybe. But yeah, they are published, so you can either buy copies or get them through your local library.
Okay, an anonymous attendee is asking about, are there enough sources to research a more recent house, a 1950s house in Dublin?
There just isn't really. I mean, you'll get the Valuation Office revision books for about 20 to 30 years on it, and you'll be able to look at the street directories. So all it's going, you'll be able to identify a few of the people who lived in the house and perhaps date its construction. But there's very little else, unless you were to do, say, a newspaper search for that specific address to find out if, did somebody get murdered or a crime committed at the house. But actually, that's about it, really. There's not much to tell on more recent houses, other than sort of the local history, but not in sort of documentary sources.
Okay, a query from Noreen Harrington. Can you give me some information on labourers' cottages? Who were they given to and why? Would they have been rented or bought?
Sorry, don't trample over you, Natalie, so jump in when you want to. I mean, I suppose it's a vague term that they're, a large landholding may have had labourers' cottages built to accommodate labourers employed on an estate. And then we have like other organisations like the railways built cottages for their employees, and other sort of charitable organisations built what you could probably describe as a labourer's cottage. So I don't think there's really a sort of a form or a standard or a sort of a system of the construction of labourer's cottages. I think that a lot of what we describe as labourer's cottages were simply vernacular buildings that were built on a small landholding by the occupier at some point.
George O'Rourke just came back in to say thank you very much for the clarification and congrats to you both on a very interesting talk. A query here, and then we'll begin to wind up. I'm sure you're both tired. Tara O'Brien just is making comment about Charles Coote's surveys. She says Charles Coote surveys may also be a useful resource. General view of the agriculture and manufactures of the Kings County, Offaly. Some good detail about the larger houses, along with the idiosyncrasies of particular communities. I'll bet. And actually, Tara, the same lady asking just whether you have anything promising to offer about the potential release of land commission records.
Oh, don't mention the war.
I knew that would come up.
I'm not going to get myself into trouble by saying anything.
Nor me.
We're waiting. Pressure is being applied where possible, and we're just going to have to hang in there and see what happens. But I don't know of any movement.
Okay, a little bit like the 2026 census, nothing to see here for another couple of years. I'll just see if there's anybody else. Right, if that's okay, ladies, that's about it in terms of, I think we've dealt with most of the questions. I'd like to thank you both very much again for your absorbing talk. You really did explain sources that aren't always the most accessible and can be quite challenging to use, and you certainly simplified them for us. I'd like to thank you, our audience. For those of you who were able to tune in, apologies again for the issue with the late arrival of the emails with the details for tuning into the talk. And for those of you who perhaps were not able to tune in at all, we will be making the talk available on our YouTube channel tomorrow, and we'll be tweeting about it. So do keep an eye on our Twitter page because we will link to it. Our next public talk will take place on the 29th of June and will focus on the dismantling of the workhouse system in Ireland. So please keep an eye on our website and on our Twitter account, and we will endeavour to make sure that the details arrive in plenty of time for the next event. Thank you, Nicola and Natalie, yet again. Thank you all for joining us. Wishing you all a very enjoyable evening. Gur míle maith go léir agus slán go fóill.